Hello everyone, my talk will be about the evaluation of diversity in news recommender system. I will first introduce the work and related concepts. Then I will detail our case study and some of our findings. And finally, I will give you the main conclusions detailed in the form of take-home messages. So first, let's remember how a news recommender system works. The principle is that there is a multitude of resources available that a user can access. Based on his access history, the news recommender system will recommend other resources to direct his attention toward news that is suitable to his needs or preferences. However, while necessary, this filtering of recommended news brings an important limitation because it only recommends resources in line with the user's prior beliefs and thus only covers a limited range of opinions. This participates in the enclosure of users in filter bubbles, contributing to political polarization. However, an intuitive solution to those bubbles consists in increasing the diversity of recommended news. In that context, diversity corresponds to the diversity of the content that the user can access. The objective is threefold. First, to provide a larger spectrum of opinions covering all the political spectrum, but also to ensure ethical and fair recommendations conveying different points of view on specific themes, and finally, to foster a healthy democratic debate, which can be threatened by the development of filter bubbles. However, in some cases, some researchers have shown that diversity can increase rather than reduce polarization, so the diversity must be finely controlled in news recommender systems. This is why we have defined a first research question, which is, does the diversity of recommendations bring a systematic gain? In particular, we seek to determine the extent to which the diversity impacts the news consumption behaviors of users and contribute to broadening their news consumption. Finally, regarding the evaluation of news recommender systems, it must take specific characteristics into account at the very short lifespan of news and their high turnover. In addition, as we have seen, news recommender systems have a democratic role and plays a prominent role in the political debate. These specificities require adapting both the recommendation and evaluation processes. This is why we wondered whether is it sufficient to measure the influence of a news recommender system afterward with single number metrics, or does this influence occur with some variations over time? To contribute to this reflection, we studied diversity in a well-known dataset, and I will present to you some of our results in this second part. We selected the MIND dataset provided by Microsoft News and containing both information about news and users' interactions, recorded for 5 weeks between October and November 2019. After filtering and pre-processing the data, we kept information about 1,475 users and a bit more than 20,500 news. From the provided URL, we retrieved the news content and gave it bag-of-word representation using the LDA algorithm. We also retrieved the publication date, which is of great interest for our temporal analysis. Then, for each user, we had access to his history of consultations during the first 4 weeks of data collection, as well as the list of news that have been recommended to him during the 5th week, among which we know which have been accessed or not. The diversity of these sets of news was evaluated for each user using a common metric defined by Smith and McLeave and corresponding to the average dissimilarity of each pair of items. Here, the similarity was calculated using cosine similarity. So for our holistic analysis, we computed the diversity of the history, recommended news, accessed news, and unaccessed news for each user, while for our temporal analysis, we computed the diversity of news accessed each week by each user. So let's now have a look at the holistic analysis. So here we have the distribution of the number of users over the diversity values for each of the 4 diversity measured. So we can see that the average diversity of recommended news is high and the standard deviation is small, reflecting a high level of diversity in the recommendations for all users. If we now take a look at the distribution of users' diversity in access news in blue, we can see that the average diversity is lower. So the users access news items that are on average less diversified than recommended ones. And we can also observe a great variability in the average diversity among users. This distribution is similar to the one of the history in pink, but we can notice that the average diversity is slightly lower. So from these and other results that you can find in the paper, we concluded first that the news recommender system used by Microsoft meets a predefined diversity level. Second, this system seems to have an impact on news consumption as the distribution of diversity values varies between the history and the last week. And finally, this diversity input doesn't seem to be personalized. To answer our first research question, we can say that a high diversity in recommendation is far from leading to a systematic diverse news consumption. Let's now analyze the extent to which the news recommender systems impact users' news consumption over time. To explore temporal variations, we separated users into 4 groups of equal size based on the quarters measured on diversity values. So quarter 1 contains users accessing the least diverse content, while quarter 4 contains users accessing the most diverse content. In the Sankey diagrams that you can see on the right part of the slide, we have represented the variations of groups made by all users from one week to the next. We see that transition patterns remain stable over weeks and that every possible transition exists. So we can conclude that the average diversity of access news actually differs over weeks and these variations occur at the user level. We've also seen that the impact is not the same for all users, as some change groups, sometimes from one extreme to another, and others do not. To go further, based on these and other more comprehensive analyses that you can find in the paper, we were able to define 3 types of users according to their receptiveness to recommendations diversity. First, we have positively receptive users corresponding to users accessing more diverse news after 5 weeks of use of the system. By contrast, we have negatively receptive users. And finally, some users were defined as resistant users because they access equally diverse content after 5 weeks. Altogether, these results provide some answers to our second research question. We've seen that common single number evaluation seems insufficient because there is a need to take differences between users and temporal aspects into account. To summarize, we have highlighted 2 important points. First, an increase in diversity in recommendation does not systematically lead to diversified news consumptions and therefore does not necessarily address the problem of filter bubbles. Secondly, we have shown that the news recommender system does not impact all users equally and that we can identify different classes of users' behavior with respect to viewing diversity. I will now give you the main conclusion of this work, which we feel are important to remember. So first, as the diversity of consumed news varies over weeks, it seems essential to us to define well-established methodologies to model the diversity trajectory of users. This modeling should ideally capture the full range of factors influencing news consumption and potentially contributing to the political polarization of the user. Related to this, there is a crucial need to define both new diversity measures and personalized recommendation strategies. New measures have to be adapted to the specificities of the news recommendation domain. These measures will be very beneficial to adopt recommendation strategies adapted to users' personality traits and to help to increase the adoption of diversified sets of news. Finally, we think that there is a lack of open data sets that cover a significantly longer period to study the impact of news recommender systems in the long run. We also lack of richer data sets that can include additional information about the user, the context, or even the news to provide a more accurate model of the impacts and adoption of the recommendations. So thank you all for listening and do not hesitate to contact me.